Let's start with a picture that accompanied some recent headlines. Here are Presidents Obama and Medvedev signing a new treaty reducing the size of American and Russian nuclear arsenals, which account for more than 90% of the world's most dangerous weapons, and just as important, reducing the two countries' reliance on nuclear deterrence for their defense and maintaining a regime of transparency about their strategic forces. There's a lot of history behind what these two leaders are doing. Let's review that history. For thousands of years, including most of the modern age, there was a pattern to war and peace. First came war, then came peace. It took terrible catastrophes, outbreaks of increasing destruction, before the combatants were sufficiently bloodied and exhausted to sit down and talk. Here are a few examples. It took the 30 Years' War to bring about the Treaty of Westphalia. That pact brought into being a system for keeping the peace based on the creation of the nation-state and the willingness of those states to respect each other's sovereignty. Then, it took the Napoleonic Wars to set the scene for the marathon of diplomacy known as the Congress of Vienna, and to bring about the Concert of Europe. That system was based on balance of power between the major European countries and empires of the time. But it didn't last either. We had to suffer through World War I before there could be even the false start of the League of Nations, which was a miserable failure in part because the United States stayed out of it. We had to suffer and had to go through World War II before we had more success with the creation of the United Nations. So what do those cases have in common? They have this. Progress, such as it was reactive, and in dealing with the threat of nuclear war and the accompanying danger of nuclear proliferation, we have been, and we need to continue to be, proactive. The quantum leap in destructive power was so great that it made war between the major powers suicidal and therefore obsolete. With the advent of nuclear weapons, it was no longer necessary to defeat an opponent's armed forces before inflicting massive destruction on a society. Let me illustrate that point with a picture. What you see here is the so-called Tsar bomb, a Soviet weapon 6,500 times more powerful than the American one dropped on Hiroshima. It weighed 27 tons, making it too heavy for any Soviet bomber to carry. So savor that irony for what it's worth. The U.S.-Soviet standoff had its hairy moments. The most dangerous, of course, came in October 1962. U.S. strategic forces went to high alert as the U.S. Navy blockaded the island. Not only was that crisis resolved, but the close call helped keep us from going over the brink in the decades that followed. That was largely because the danger itself induced the creation of a complex set of treaties. One, still in force today, began with the so-called Atoms for Peace proposal that Dwight Eisenhower made to the United Nations. That led to a series of nuclear test ban treaties, starting with one that John F. Kennedy signed, and that, in turn, led to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, here being signed by Lyndon Johnson's representative and the Soviet foreign minister. Then came the SALT I anti-ballistic missile, or ABM, treaty between Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev, and SALT II, signed by Jimmy Carter. The Strategic Arms Reduction talks, or START, were begun by President Ronald Reagan and President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, and then consummated by George Herbert Walker Bush. This arms control and non-proliferation regime kept the peace between adversarial superpowers and their armed camps, Nato and the Warsaw Pact. After the end of the USSR and the Iron Curtain, Bill Clinton tried to keep that regime in place. He ensured that the USSR's breakup did not lead to new nuclear weapon states on the territory of the old Soviet Union by persuading Ukraine to give up what was the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. And Clinton also tried to strengthen the regime by signing the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Then came George W. Bush, who was skeptical about the need for treaties in general and arms control treaties in particular. Early on in his presidency, he pulled the United States out of the SALT I ABM treaty that had been signed by Richard Nixon. He shelved the START process approved by his own father, replacing it with a two-page agreement that included no limits on launchers, no counting rules, and no verification provisions. He allowed the Comprehensive Test Ban to languish without ratification in the Senate. As for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, conceived by Dwight Eisenhower and put into force under Lyndon Johnson, Mr. Bush took a number of steps that weakened it, leaving its future under a question mark. These constitute just a few examples of Mr. Bush's unilateralism, his preference for going it alone in the world. That world that existed at the end of the Bush presidency threatened to bring about the following reality. We'll begin with the 5 states that already had nuclear arsenals when the NPT entered into force in 1970 and were in effect grandfathered, that is, allowed to keep their weapons, but with the explicit provision in the treaty that over time they would negotiate the elimination of their arsenals. Now let's look at what happened in the 40 years since the NPT went into force. Another 4 states have joined the nuclear club, but not the NPT club. That is Israel, which is assumed to have the bomb, and India, Pakistan, and North Korea, which have all tested the bomb. So that brings the total to 9. Now let's look at a notional but all too plausible list of countries that might go nuclear in the years to come if the NPT in effect collapses altogether. This list includes, in addition to Iran, countries like Brazil and Taiwan that were once developing nuclear weapons but often under pressure from the United States agreed to stop doing so. Countries like Ukraine and South Africa that had weapons but gave them up, and countries including American allies like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Japan that might very well go nuclear in the future if that future is ungoverned by the NPT. So you see that the box score indicates that we're looking at a world with something like 25 nuclear-armed states. That is a very dangerous world. President Obama has tried to reboot the process of negotiated arms control and nonproliferation, including at the Nuclear Security Summit in Washington in early April, and the nearly worldwide participation in a conference to review and strengthen the NPT that was recently conducted in New York. The administration has also announced a new nuclear posture review that narrows the circumstances in which the United States would consider using nuclear weapons. These and other measures, including an attempt to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, are meant to make it possible to run that box score backward, if possible to 0, just as the NPT itself requires us to do. Many prominent figures in U.S. foreign policy have come out in favor of running that scoreboard backwards, and that goal has had mainstream political support largely because of these 4 statesmen: Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, and Bill Perry, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, who wrote an article in January 2007 in the Wall Street Journal urging that we make abolition of nuclear weaponry a long-term goal of U.S. policy. At their first meeting in London last year, Presidents Obama and Medvedev endorsed that goal and have taken a modest but real step in that direction with the new START treaty. But there are plenty of tough issues ahead and tough negotiations as well, notably with the Russians themselves, who are going to be driving a hard bargain on many issues, including limiting U.S. missile defenses, like this interceptor due to be deployed in the North and Mediterranean seas by the U.S. Navy Aegis ships in 2011. It also means hard work with U.S. allies, especially the French, who prize their own nuclear deterrent and don't want to be forced into reductions as a result of U.S.-Russian progress in that regard. There will also have to be talks and tough negotiations with the Chinese, who have built up their own nuclear capabilities. But perhaps the most difficult challenge of all, and certainly the most immediate one, is going to be in the United States Senate, which must ratify by a two-thirds majority any treaty for it to take effect. The administration faces some difficult questions on the new Strategic Arms Treaty, but the much more difficult battle will be over the comprehensive test ban, which is already the target of a concerted campaign by opponents.